Hey everyone, in this week's video, we're making this super cute itty bitty paper piece project. It's one of Carol Doak's designs. It's a great lap project. It's perfect for hand sewing on your couch, but you can also do it at your sewing machine. So let's get started. First, you need the pattern. So head on over to Carol's site. She has tons of free paper piecing patterns with easy to follow instructions. I've done many of her patterns myself and they always turn out great. The cutting list is so helpful, you'll constantly refer back to it, so make sure to print it out as well. Now you can either print out the design and transfer it to the piecing paper, or print right on the piecing paper. I don't like to waste ink, so I just carefully trace the pattern with a ruler and pin. Remember to mark your numbers and to draw a 1/4 inch seam allowance around your pattern as shown by the dotted line. Cut between the two dotted lines to separate the patterns for piecing. Now, even if you've done some paper piecing in the past, you might find this pattern to be a little tricky at times because it is so small, but I'll show you some tricks and you'll have it down in no time. Just like any paper piecing pattern, your first piece of fabric goes in your number 1 spot and it is face up. Now the cutting list says the number 1 pattern piece should be made of green fabric, but I've chosen to replace it with sparkly purple fabric. The trick with paper piecing is to make sure your fabric piece is always at least a 1/4 inch larger than the pattern shape on all sides. Because these pieces are so small, just err on the larger side just to be safe. I also like to make sure my piece always touches the dotted line as well, so I know that it reaches the end of the seam allowance. So now let's do the number 2 spot. It calls for black fabric. The number 2 spot is super tiny, so it's kind of hard to see. We're going to place our black fabric face down on top of the purple fabric, then lift up both pieces of fabric to find the line between spot number 1 and spot number 2. Take your black fabric and scoot it about a 1/4 inch over that line. So once we sew along the line between the number 1 spot and the number 2 spot, we flip the fabric over and you have your first seam. Let's take it to the machine. Now it's just a matter of sewing on top of the line between the number 1 and the number 2 space. I start my stitch at the edge of the seam allowance and then sew on top of the line because I think it ends up with better results. Because these lines are so small, sew slowly and press your backstitch button right before the line ends. You don't want to accidentally sew into another space. Now we just flip the black fabric over and press. You must press so you end up with a clean, crisp finish. You can also go back and trim off excess fabric to reduce bulk, though it's not absolutely required. Now we repeat the exact same steps with the number 3 piece of fabric. Place right sides down, scooch it at least a 1/4 inch over the line, and sew. Again, sew slowly and press your backstitch button right before you get to the end of the line. Flip it down and press. Now place your fabric for the number 4 spot, right sides down, exactly as you have been doing. You'll have to backstitch at the beginning and the end of the line. Because the line along the number 4 space is right in the middle of your pattern, you must make sure you only stitch on top of the line that borders between the number 4, 2, 1, and 3 space. Flip the fabric over and press. Repeat that sequence until you've sewn all of the lines. You should end up with something that looks like this. Now this needs to be trimmed down a bit, so flip it over and grab your ruler and rotary cutter. Line up the ruler along the seam allowance and carefully trim. Repeat on all 4 sides. Again, you can go back and clean up some of the unnecessary fabric to reduce bulk, but you don't have to. And there you have the first half finished. You do the second half the exact same way, except your number 1 piece is a number 9. So exactly as we did before, place your fabric face down, sew along the line, and repeat for all the spaces. Your second piece will look like this. Again, we have to trim it down a bit so it looks nice and clean. See how the 2 pieces will fit together? They just need to be sewn together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you can use this line as a guide. And there you go, a cat and a pumpkin. Don't forget to press. Now you can finish up this project many ways. You can frame it in some cardstock as the original design shows. You could quickly finish the back with a piece of fabric, sewn right sides together and flipped, kind of like making a pillow, and attach a ribbon for hanging. I decided to go the difficult route and finish mine like you would a quilt. I added backing and finished the edges with folded binding. I only recommend finishing the project this way if you've worked with binding before. Because the project is so small, it's very hard to connect the two ends of the binding together. Then it's just a matter of flipping the binding over the raw edge and hand sewing in place. I finished this off with a little ribbon bow so that I could hang it from a doorknob. I hope you enjoyed this little project. Be sure to subscribe by clicking that button below for more sewing videos.